Thank you so much, Jonathan. Secretary Donovan, the Director, Madam Anne-Marie Slaughter, Congressman Blumena, my dear friend, Judith, distinguished ambassadors, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I think that in UN Habitat I'm famous for long speeches. I want to make this a brief one. So I came here on my own without being assisted by anything, as you can see. I would like to say that this is really a great occasion. And since it is a dinner, and actually although I'm an academic, but I spent my life being married to a diplomat who departed prematurely, but a diplomat all the same, I'm going to make this brief, very brief. I would like to say that this occasion for me, particularly coming at this particular moment in time, I would like to call it God-sent, because I have no other way of expressing what is happening for UN Habitat, for the urban poor in the world, and as we have already heard from Dr. Anne-Marie, they are increasing in numbers. And we must stop deluding ourselves. The trajectory is very clear. If we don't put our act together, they will continue to increase. Rural-urban migration is a reality of our time. So really, I thought that, what do I say in this great, I have already praised this building. I don't know who was the architect. In UN Habitat, that's the UN place where you find architects and urban planners. And I don't know who was the great people who designed this fabulous space. I would like to say that, to make my point, and really it is also a parting point, and particularly, if I may, Dr. Anne-Marie, I'm going to address you this evening. I would like to make a political case for supporting substantive support to the urban poor, because this is a neglected majority which is rising. As you have heard, and as an academic by profession, I would like to say that there is a conceptual error, almost an omission, deluding ourselves that you could fight urbanization, that you could glorify rural economies. I'm a trained agricultural economist by profession, so I know what I'm talking about at a professional level. Urbanization is a natural trend of structural transformation if things are going right. Agriculture is a residual employer. As agricultural productivity rises faster than in industries and services, the surplus, the rural surplus, has to move to cities and towns to look for more gainful employment. Ladies and gentlemen, this natural cause of structural transformation is not taking place in the cities and towns of the developing world. So we have a challenge of what is called premature urbanization. When people are pushed out of their rural livelihoods, going into cities, hoping they can improve their lot, only to end up in urban squalor. Which means the development actors, USAID, and this evening I was having a chat with colleagues from the USAID and others, which means rural development is important, but rural development can never be disconnected for the urban economies. After all, agriculture can never develop unless you have a market for the surplus. Who is going to improve rural productivity if there is no market for the surplus? So we are basically talking about the rural-urban linkages, because we need prosperous cities and towns if we are going to improve agricultural productivity. So I would like to say that within the international development fraternity, there is a conceptual gap there is not enough understanding of this connection. My story is very simple. I joined the United Nations in 1998 not to work for the UN Habitat. As an economist, I actually finally decided to take an application and apply for the UN when the World Trade Organization was formed. Because I knew now we are in business. Let us go to agree on how we are going to trade. We need a level playing field for everybody. So in 1998, I ended up in Geneva as the director of the least developed countries. I was charged with capacity building in trade negotiations. I was in Seattle in 1999 at the World Trade Organization. But that was to be my last summit at UNCTAD. The Secretary General of the day, Mr. Kofi Annan, decided that, Anna, you are going to be working for housing and urban development. So if there is a vision here, I have to recognize the former Secretary General, Mr. Kofi Annan, who decided that he wanted a reorientation of the Habitat program. He said it had not been on the right track. So I ended up in Nairobi, a great place to be. And really, that is the UN headquarters of the environment. The UN programs for the environment are all based in Nairobi. There are two programs there. The United Nations Habitat, which is here today, but also our partners, the United Nations Environmental Program. These are what are called within the UN cycles the Stockholm agencies. They were both created in 1972 at the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. Let me emphasize human environment. Two working groups were in discussion. One on the natural environment, which became UNEP, another one on the built-up environment or the living environment, call it brownfields, which became habitat. But alas, there was no agreement on the fate of the built-up environment. While Mrs. Indira Gandhi and other developing country leaders of the time argued that poverty was the biggest polluter, there were others who were not so sure. But one thing was in agreement. How do we provide affordable housing and investments for municipal infrastructure? So the Habitat and Human Settlements Foundation was created in Stockholm in 1972. So this agency has been around for a long time. But because of a number of reasons for which we don't have time on a dinner session to go into details, it really never materialized until 2001, as you have already heard, when it was decided that something definitely had gone amiss, and we have to upgrade this program to do its work. So, dear friends of the Habitat Agenda, the Habitat Agenda is very simple. It is adequate shelter for all and sustainable human settlements development in an urbanizing world. That is a summit in Istanbul. But 2001, the General Assembly added another reality of our time, a globalizing world. So the General Assembly in 2001 transformed UN Habitat after I had simply made it very clear to Mr. Kofi Annan that I was going to do my best, but if the structure is wrong, of course I would be constrained. And then the rest followed. Now, this particular evening is an auspicious occasion for me, because I landed in Nairobi, not far away from my home country, Tanzania, which is just across the border. And I was determined. I normally try to do my best. You have to do your best. I only believe in best effort. The results is in the hands of God. But under best efforts, when I arrived in Nairobi, I had to look around for my staff members, and I asked them, I'm sorry about this, Chris Williams, you will have to stand up so that people can see you. So I had Chris Williams. And I said, Chris, we have to go to look for friends. I was going around Europe and places. How do we transform this organization to be able to deliver its mandate? So Chris and I arrived here in Washington. We were looking for friends. And the African in me, Chris knows that. I told him that, Chris, I'm not going to be able to handle the evening if Mrs. Diana Negropont is not in the room. And I'm so pleased to say that actually I just met Mrs. Diane Negropont. Please, Mrs. Diane, wherever you are. Ms. Diane Negropont is the one who introduced Chris William and I on Capitol Hill looking for friends in the Department of State. And really, for me, this is the actualization of that first step that we must take. And Congressman Blumenauer, you organized a briefing for me. This was in 2002, and I invited you to come to the summit in Johannesburg, which you did, so I'm so pleased to see you here. So let me say the following, that the dichotomy, the false dichotomy between rural and urban must end if we are going to deliver sustainable development. As we prepare ourselves now to go to Copenhagen on the climate talks, the issues are clear: adaptation, mitigation, technology transfer, and of course, international support. The group of 77 and others I will be talking about, so where are the funds to support all this? I would like to say that, Madam Anne-Marie Slaughter, if I can now address you as I started, I'm normally trying to be focused, to say there is a political case for breaking this disconnect, mismatch, conceptual error, if I may say that, to think that you could develop the rural without the urban, or the urban without the rural. The two go together. Premature urbanization is a problem. I did say this morning that in Africa, I was invited by Prime Minister Tony Blair of the UK to serve on the Commission for Africa. And after I had been able to convince former Prime Minister Blair and Gordon Brown and Sir Nixon to take a walk in the slums of Nairobi, finally, when we wrote our report, which went to the G8 summit in Green Eagles, the conclusion was clear. The single challenge facing Africa, for example, and its future after HIV/AIDS is chaotic urbanization. Because if you don't prevail over this scourge, it means you are wasting your investment, you will have to raise down whatever you have done. So really, in looking for friends, then finally, I found Dr. Judith Rodin, Dr. Warren Walker, the Rockefeller Foundation, and many, many friends. I will not be able to mention many names around the table. So let me say the following, that really, we really need public support if we are going to leverage enough support from the private sector, which must take the lead finally in matters of housing and urban development. Because there is no government which has enough money to give free housing, for example. In Kenya, where we are based, we are working on a Kenya slum upgrading program. I'm pleased to say that the first beneficiaries of that program have now moved from Kibera into their first apartments. But the government of Kenya, as many other governments in the developing countries, and I believe also here in the United States, cannot give free housing to everybody. The good news is the poor take care of themselves. This notion about helping the poor take care of themselves. All they need is empowerment. All they need is support. In the case of Kibera and many African slums, even Asia, they pay the rents which are so high that the payback period for those who invest in the slums is only 9 months in the case of Kenya. So which means there is a room for public-private partnerships. So this is really the note on which I would like to end, making a political appeal for reasonable support to move this project forward. I thank you for your kind attention and for your wonderful hospitality.